Okay, so we're joined today by Gav Smith to talk about digital surveillance and governance. Thanks for joining us, Gav. You can find out more about Gav's work here. I've got a link there too to Gav's newer stuff on him catching snakes every day down in Canberra. So if you're interested in um, Gav's work around that, please check that out. But can you tell us a bit about your work when it comes to digital governance and surveillance, please?
Yeah, hi Steve. Hi everyone. Thanks for having me along. I'm just talking to you guys from Ngunnawal and Ngambri country today. So I have been looking at surveillance really in everyday life for the last 20 years, really, of my career. And I've been really interested in sort of the rise of digital surveillance technologies in particular and their sort of social impacts and effects, and how they sort of like consolidate forms of power. I started off my work really interested in the rise of CCTV, and that's closed circuit television cameras in the UK. And I did an ethnography of a number of different CCTV control rooms. So those places, those kind of centers of calculation where images are processed by
Mhm.
human operators and made sense of, and decisions are made about risk. And these operators were largely looking out onto public spaces and private spaces like supermarkets and shopping centers, urban streets, and they were paid and tasked with trying to identify disorderly behavior or unbelonging people, matter out of place, as Mary Douglas famously termed a cultural anthropologist, and then basically use the surveillance technologies to monitor and profile those individuals and potentially, if they cross the threshold of risk or undesirability, have them excluded from those kinds of spaces. So that was my PhD research. And I was also really interested, I should say, in the actual social psychological consequences of that work. So the emotional dimensions of that labor. So what I mean by that is these individuals were working very long shifts, these camera operators, and they were often witnessing very disturbing spectacles through the cameras, like very, traumatic scenes
Mhm.
of people being attacked, people being hit by cars, people injecting drugs, prostitution, missing children, really difficult kinds of scenes to kind of try and capture and make some intervention from a distance in. And so I actually found that a number of the operators I spoke to were very stressed with the work they did, and it really affected their subjective base.
Yeah. Okay. And then and since your PhD work, a lot of this kind of stuff has been thinking about surveillance is more kind of automated and done through data as much through the kind of the camera kind of CCTV TV thing, right?
Yeah, so absolutely. So I became really interested in that sort of that idea, that notion of the work of watching, what I've kind of just described. And then from that, I started to think more about, the other end of the lens, as it were, or metaphor of the lens of like how do people perform themselves through visibility, and how are they sort of governed through that visibility as well. So that's really that sort of switch in my work to sort of looking more at the work of being watched, and that's really where I became very interested in that exact sort of moment. All these new digital devices and infrastructures were emerging,
Yeah.
and consolidating, and really affecting our culture, our ways of operating, and ways of thinking about ourselves, and ways of social life was increasingly flowing through these kinds of platforms and devices. And I became really interested in the political economy of that. So like how much uh, revenue and capital is being kind of like generated through this kind of encounter and interaction, and the sort of mass collection of data and profiling of data, processing of data,
Yep.
ownership of data. But I was more interested, I think, in the kind of the everyday work that people do, not necessarily consciously, but sort of habits of visibility that
Yep.
people are engaged in, and that's really where this kind of work came from. So that sort of sense of what a device sort of means to the person, and how much they engage with it, and how it starts to shape their sense of subjectivity and who they are, and how they perform that to a sort of an
Yeah.
external audience.
So can you tell us a little what's biosurveillance?
So yeah, so that's really I look a focus on how the body and embodiment becomes a real kind of object of concern for those people doing the surveillance. So there's a really fantastic quote here, which I think is really important for people to think about, is the way in which surveillance is, as Haggerty and Erickson says, directed towards the human body. And it's really, really important for people to think about is the way in which surveillance is, as Haggerty and Erickson says, directed towards the human body, and
Mm.
and the observed body is of a distinctly hybrid composition, as they say, and it's broken down by being abstracted from its territorial settings. And what that means is essentially these digital devices are, have geolocative features where they're able to kind of sort of extract data from us as we move around, as we engage, as we act, and then circulate that data into different kinds of centers of calculation where it becomes, mined and it becomes valued, and then obviously becomes acted on potentially. And this idea that, we have this decorporealized body, this kind of data double of pure virtuality, I think is really powerful. This idea that we almost have this data shadow that is around us all the time and it's out of our kind of control, is constantly circulating and accumulating and accreting, and it's often the actual profile of us that decisions are made that are going to affect our life chances and opportunities through this figure,
Yeah.
it being a very hybrid and very heterogeneous thing. So I found that a very rich sort of space to kind of theorize through sociologically,
Mhm.
how we care for this thing, how we understand it, how we can exercise some kind of control over it, or can we? And how much is this data sort of double shadow, whatever you want to call it, term it. They've got many different terms. How is it kind of affecting our
Yeah.
everyday lives?
Yeah, and it's done through a bunch of different ways, right? So different themes of and that self-tracking is a particular topic that is important for lots of people today in terms of managing their own health and so this very much kind of notion of governing through freedom here, right? The way we want to be healthy and good citizens and all that kind of stuff in that kind of Foucauldian sense, relates to the different ways that we're disciplined. Is that kind of in your work as well?
Absolutely, yeah. I think definitely the kind of sort of narratives that have been generated to kind of legitimate these things, to market these things, are very much framed with that idea that, we're giving you something to know yourself better through, and to be able to, optimize, to work on yourself, and to sort of like reveal biological processes that are beyond the conscious realm, that the technology can capture and stage and visualize and give you insights on, that you can act on, and that is critically framed as being something that you should be doing. You are a responsible individual by consuming these products, by having these things fitted to your body
Mm.
that are tracking your running, and you're comparing that against these other figures out there in the ether, and trying to continuously work on and improve your performances in multiple different contexts and fields.
Yeah.
And so and how these, very easily get captured by corporate kind of interests, that data is extremely valuable for making these kinds of, judgments, standards, through the aggregations that become, ways of judging normality and abnormality, and making corrective interventions, and,
Yeah.
of course, marketing products that by individuals they know better through their data trails.
Yeah, and the important thing about data too is, sociologists, we know this about our own data, is that it's all about interpretation, right? So the individual may have data on themselves, but it's then what you do with it is important, isn't it? So and it's, as it kind of, it can lead to obsessive behavior, it can lead to anxiety and stress. So there's very much a kind of risks and affordances kind of aspect to these kind of self-tracking thing, isn't there? Yeah.
Yeah, and I was really interested in, and have been in some of my writing as well, like that sort of ambiguity that I think you beautifully highlighted there, Steve, where, the data tells one story, but you feel or believe or sense another story. So I was really interested in that encounter between, sort of sensing bodies. We are complete sensorized, biological organisms that are sensing through different, senses that we have, how we feel, pain thresholds, excitement, whatever, intuition, and it's kind of like this kind of melding with this kind of data sense, that's been called, that's kind of comes through, flows through that infrastructure. And just sometimes, sometimes those map on really coherently onto each other, and
Mm.
other times there's these real kind of interesting disconnects between the data saying one thing and speaking one truth about you, to a wider audience over whom you don't know or control, and then what your kind of body, your embodied sense is of those
Yep.
processes. So really interested in that stuff, and some really rich uh, investigation that students could be doing around that kind of encounter between data sense and embodied sense.
Yep.
It's quite
Yep.
quite interesting.
And so you've interviewed people around this kind of stuff, what do you call kind of datalogical relations?
Yeah,
We have
yeah,
some quotes here. We don't have to go into them in any real kind of detail, but can you give us the gist of the some of the themes in your data here?
absolutely. And so these really were fascinating kind of, social experiences, subjective experiences of, wearing tech and having this as a kind of companion in our everyday lives. Like, and in fact, I was looking at type 1 diabetics, and of course, monitoring bodily processes and insulin levels are critical to survival, critical to well-being. So this is a very acute end of wearable tech where, these individuals have previously been manually monitoring their bodies through, of course, blood, pricking their fingers and measuring the blood glucose levels, and then moving to this kind of technological form of monitoring by, purchasing technologies on the market and literally wearing them and letting the technology increasingly monitor blood glucose levels and then administer insulin. And that's a massive process of trust making
Mm,
because you are, from having an embodied habit of monitoring how you're feeling and your blood sugar levels to a machine, an external machine doing that work for you and outsourcing it to that. Some fascinating, you can sort of see through some of these quotes, fascinating, rich
mm,
kinds of, emotional kinds of responses to what it means to, outsource that work. Because some type 1 diabetics talk about this being an full-time job
yeah.
basically, doing this kind of monitoring. So I was really interested in how they could basically through this research made sense of these machines and the data that was kind of leaking from their body into these kind of clinical contexts as well.
Yeah, and they kind of show both like positives, you can track things and it's good, but there's also issues about control and choice, isn't there, where they feel like there's kind of almost like a hauntingness of their data's going somewhere else and they don't have much control over it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it, Steve. And there was definitely anxiety there where the people using the wearable tech would have this kind of like encounter with a clinician who would say, oh, what happened here? What did you do wrong here where your lines have gone so erratic?
Yeah.
And they actually, yeah, there was actually anxiety about that. Well, I had some ice cream. I wanted to have some ice cream, and they had to account for their
Yeah.
data. And I was really interested in that kind of encounter where people are having to account for, historical processes that are mediated through this data. And
Mm.
increasingly, what some of them suggested was their own kind of bodies were kind of like almost sort of silenced and marginalized, and the data between the clinician and the type 1 diabetic, whatever, that became kind of the main media of the conversation, not the person anymore. So
Yeah.
really kind of fascinating, kind of unbodied kind of processes going on there.
Yeah. Interesting. And so you're also interested in the way that data has come into things like parenting and the notion of childhood, right? Can you tell us a little bit about that around, mothering and the kind of tethered nature that parents increasingly have to their children through different forms of technology?
Yeah, again, I think some of the students will find this, I certainly find it extremely fascinating where, obviously parenting is one of those like acute sort of experiences of like you're full on delivering care 100% to this little being. You're the only one responsible for doing that, and it's on you to do it well. And there's a lot of societal pressure around how we parent, an effective parent and responsibilization of that as well. And so again, a really interesting area. And of course, like children are this really transitional kind of population. And so obviously, Steve, you know this brilliantly in your work. And there's a lot of focus. It
Mm.
falls on young people as the future, as risks to be managed, and all this kind of thing, and the kind of non kind of persons until they reach a certain age of maturity, whatever.
Yep.
And so this is a very fertile market space for technology companies to come along and say, look, we know this is really hard, but here is a product that's going to make your parenting better, your
Mm.
parental gaze more effective, more prevalent, and your control over that little bundle, more sophisticated and refined. And so it's, yeah, it's that whole kind of emotional, affective realm of manipulation I'm really interested in. And so, yeah, I became really interested in something like that work as well. How these new devices, like, and I got some in the slides there about the sort of tweet pea kind of thing that monitors when a nappy is wet and gives the very gendered here, the mother generally a prompt on their phone that the nappy needs to be changed and to order a new pack of nappies, blah blah blah.
Mm.
It's just really interesting, and these kind of like watches, of course, that are very common now,
Yep.
GPS watches, where parents are increasingly buying them, put them on, and being able to kind of like remotely monitor where their child is. And there's something about this, this kind of sense of like that in the world we live in now, where everything is so fast and accelerated, and we're under so much pressure, and we're working more. There's more commuting time. There's this sort of sense of like absence that often parents, I think, feel that they're kind of like not connected to their children because of all these other external structural constraints. And so these technologies basically afford that virtual intimacy,
Yep.
which that's the way they're marketed and the rhetorics are. And so I find that really interesting that they're kind of like a bit of a technological salvation for what are very deeply entrenched social and structural kinds of issues.
Yeah, and you're touching upon here the kind of broader structural things in it about like the moral panics about, parenting styles, helicopter parenting, the fact that like children need to be protected and all that kind of stuff. And it's kind of very much speaks into the youth studies work that I've done over the years, as you've kind of pointed out. And what I find interesting about this, like when the mobile phone first came out, like there was those amazing studies done where parents were using them, giving them to their kids to kind of use them as a digital tether. But like teenagers in particular kind of quickly discover ways they can kind of mess around with this. So they'd leave them off. Or if they were at a noisy party when their parents rang, they'd walk out of the house and go down the block and talk to them in a quiet space. So there's this like the
Yeah.
digital nature of the data and what it does and what it tells you and how it kind of makes you control or care. But there's also the kind of object of that can often resist as well. And we see this through all these kind of different technology kind of introductions over the many decades, don't we? So, but
Yeah.
what also seems to happen here is there's a whole industry, isn't there, based on exploiting people's anxiety. And I think the nappy one's a really good example that you just gave. It's almost the perfect example of kind of digital surveillance capitalism. Your
Yeah.
baby's got a wet nappy, automatically orders new nappies, like money changes hands. Like that seems to be almost the perfect encapsulation of it. Yeah.
Yeah, and always, marketed and sold in those very positive terms of like, we're making your life easier and smoother
Yeah.
and simpler. And I feel like one of my concerns here is just how much we outsource our,
Mm.
habits and practices to these devices, very sort of, without thinking, and not necessarily connecting these things up to the deep economic, relations that they're embedded in, and I just think, yeah, absolutely what you're saying about so much of this comes around through those kinds of fears of not doing enough or not being present. And I find this actually with the camera operators would often complain that they felt distance from the action that they were observing, and they found an impotency about not being able to directly intervene in a situation that was
Yeah.
happening on the streets. They have to go through radios and I think there's something similar going on there, even in this kind of context of parenting and that parental gaze, of the kinds of risks that parents are imagining that their children are encountering, and trying their best. They're doing it out of the right reasons to try and protect their children, but often, as you said, Steve, the children end up appropriating the device in different ways, or the devices don't work in the way they think
Yeah.
they're going to work. And there's something I want to just mention as well. I think that sense of the child being watched at a distance is something I'm really interested in. That subjective experience of them kind of knowing there's a kind of this paternalism that's behind this, a gaze that's constantly on, that they can't make mistakes
Mm.
because it's going to be caught, it's going to be recorded. And I was kind of interested in just drawing. It might seem quite a weird example, but the extreme example, but drawing on that kind of people on parole, remandees that are wearing electronic monitoring bracelets, and also bringing in some of their narratives of how
Yep.
it feels like to be, subject to that very involuntary kinds of form of monitoring. So yeah,
Yep.
that was
Yeah, I sat next to a woman in a meeting the other day who was obviously I was getting distracted by it. Who had this kind of thing on her phone where she was obviously tracking her daughter,
yeah,
and she was looking at it like every 5 minutes. So I don't know what was going on, but it was also from her end in terms of doing the disciplining and control. it seemed to me that she was spending most of her day doing this as well.
Yeah.
Like, and this was a kind of, a researcher that has a very busy job. So there's a kind of interesting kind of way that like the responsibility for it and the distractions and how it becomes kind of this all-encompassing thing that people can invest themselves in that, you know, maybe isn't all that healthy as well. So yeah,
Yeah,
despite the fact that it's kind of as promoted as healthy and this kind of stuff as well. So
yeah,
yeah.
and there's something really interesting about that as well. The ways in which these things generate habits. And I know you're again really interested in that concept, habitus, habit. I'm
Mm.
also interested in that, how these things sort of train us to act in particular ways without us really cognitively being aware of that kind of immersion in the screen and that kind of weird distanciation of like,
Yeah.
looking at your kids somewhere else in the world or somewhere else in another place and having that kind of weird time space compression. So all fascinating sociological material
Yeah.
there.
Yeah. Yeah.
And yeah, this the
The
smartwatch.
smartwatch here reminds me here, the quote at the end here, like this is the second one they had to get because she accidentally jumped in the pool where in the last one. I instantly think to myself, I wonder how accidental that was.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and, and,
Yeah.
and and it's just a really nice fertile area again for students to think about interesting research questions and projects about, how you go about doing some of this sociologically, interviewing obviously children about their experiences of this tech and
Mm.
how they navigate it, and then the parents, and then looking at the
Yeah.
marketing rhetorics and looking at, how that sense of geography is kind of like interrupted potentially by the technological mediation of it through a device that's kind of circulating this information to marketers,
Yeah.
app designers, obviously government officials, potentially parents, and where the child sort of figures in that and where their voice is
Mm.
in that is something that's really, really sort of fascinating.
Yeah. Okay, and we've talked a little about the digital tether stuff already, so we don't need to go over that
Yeah.
at the moment. So, and then yeah, this is interesting. This is the last one, I think. Like this compensation for absence, and again, we were mentioning here about like busy work lives and traveling to work and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, you kind of pointed out here that there seems to be a bit of a compensation for that busyness in a way.
Yeah, I feel this whole nanny cam sort of thing, putting cameras up all over the houses, in daycare centers. So much of this is about obviously risk management, but it's more than just risk management. It's also about, I think, that capacity you beautifully articulate with your colleague of just being able to on a phone just quickly, I wonder what Tommy's doing right now. I want to be able to make this kind of visual contact with my son remotely. And but also the ways in which, like in this case, this kind of bear that's kind of doubling up as a sort of surveillance agent, what that's doing at the level of like, self-creation of the individual, like, they're being almost like trained through these kind of mundane objects to
Mm,
be kind of docile surveillance subjects, and to have very intimate and mundane experiences constantly captured and recorded and circulated. I'm really interested in that, like what kind of exhaustion that sets up.
yeah.
I kind of use the term quite deliberately, in terms of the exhaust coming off you as you're kind of constantly leaking data into
Yeah.
these different kind of containers, but also, the exhaustive process of working on what impressions are being leaked from your body and how they're being kind of read in very different code and different ways and profiled. So I was kind of just interested in, just the students thinking themselves about those kind of environments, and it gets me onto the work I'm sort of been doing recently on facial recognition, but those environments where, they're walking through, they're engaging with, and how they're being set up to become surveillance subjects involuntarily by being present in those spaces because there's so much infrastructure that is capturing data and circulating that data, and that data is acting to sharpen governance processes for
Mm,
sometimes good reasons and sometimes less good reasons.
yeah.
And so I'm kind of interested in that, yeah, that sense of like the training and the
Yeah.
creation of the data sort of visible subject.
Yeah. Okay, and to conclude, can you just tell us a little bit about where you think this research in this field is going?
Yeah, it's a fascinating area. I hope just as a little glimpse to some of the students here about, some really, big political, biopolitical issues, big economic issues that are kind of on economic inequalities that are being very much layered through this racialization. So there's really big sociological processes happening through the medium of these technologies. And I think it's a very difficult space to work in because, of course, a lot of these processes are happening in a very black box fashion. So you can't just go up to Google and say, "Hey Google, can I look at some of your data you collect and how you use that?" And third parties are. So there's a lot of kind of obfuscation that you have to navigate doing this research on this. But of course, what students can absolutely focus is on that sort of rhetoric that's used by these technology companies to be able to sort of market and vend their products and
Mm.
make legitimate them, the regulations around them, and also really what's something I've been so fascinated in is focusing in on the subjective experience, the messy subjective experiences people have
Yep.
when they interact with these different forms of technology, digital technology, surveillance technology, and how they, as you said, I think really importantly, Steve, don't just always, become docile and passive subjects, but how they also resist and
Yep.
appropriate these things as well. So there's really great areas for students, and I'd really encourage them to think about this as an area to do more work in.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Gav. That was great.
Thanks for speaking to me, Steve. Thanks for
Thank
having me
you.
on.